The voice stepped off the stage and was gone. Minutes earlier, Chris Cornell was still singing, still powerful, still alive inside the sound. No collapse, no farewell, no warning anyone could point to afterward. The crowd cheered, the lights went out, the night continued. By morning, the voice that defined a generation no longer existed. How does someone survive the stage and disappear the moment he leaves it? A man strong enough to command thousands, unable to survive the hours after they went home. That contradiction is where this story truly begins. Just hours earlier, Chris Cornell stood under stage lights, fully in control. His voice did not shake. His body did not give out. Nothing about that performance suggested a goodbye. The show ended. Applause rose. The crowd left believing they had witnessed another ordinary night. They didn't know the danger wasn't on the stage. It was waiting after the noise stopped, behind a closed hotel door. There was no audience left to impress. No lights, no adrenaline, only silence, the kind that arrives when everything finally goes quiet. By morning, the voice that had carried decades of pressure was gone. There was no public warning to replay, no final message to decode, no single explanation that made the timeline feel reasonable. That is what turned this night into an open wound. Not just a loss, but the speed of it. The way control seemed to vanish in a matter of hours. How does someone survive addiction, recovery, fame, and relapse, yet break in the narrow space between applause and sleep? And if this moment wasn't sudden at all, how long had it been building, silently, while the world was still listening? Before the world knew his voice, there was silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses inward. Chris Cornell grew up in Seattle, in a home that slowly fractured without ever fully breaking. His parents divorced when he was young. The separation didn't explode. It lingered, and for a child, lingering damage can be worse than sudden loss. He was quiet, withdrawn, uncomfortable in rooms full of people. Teachers noticed it. Family noticed it. But no one had the language for what he was experiencing. Depression, anxiety, isolation. These words were not part of childhood conversations then. So what he felt remained unnamed. And unnamed pain has a way of turning inward. By his early teens, the silence had become heavy enough to shape his days. He withdrew from school, pulled back from friends. The world outside felt overwhelming, unpredictable, unsafe. Music arrived not as a dream, but as a refuge. He didn't turn to sound because he wanted attention. He turned to it because sound gave him control. When he sang, the noise came from him, not at him. That mattered. In a life where emotions felt uncontrollable, music obeyed rules. Pitch, breath, timing. For the first time, he could decide how loud the world was. This was not talent discovering itself. This was survival learning a language. As he taught himself guitar and began experimenting with vocals, something unusual emerged. His voice didn't just project. It cut wide range, raw power, and an emotional edge that felt older than his age. But that power came from tension, not ease. Even in those early years, the pattern was forming. Intensity in expression, fragility in everything else. The more he found release in music, the more ordinary life felt unbearable. School remained distant. Social spaces felt hostile. Sound was safe. Silence was not. When he finally re-entered the world, band rehearsals, small performances, late nights, it looked like growth from the outside, but inside, the original struggle never left. Music didn't remove the darkness. It gave it a voice. And that distinction would matter later, because when the world eventually applauded him, they weren't cheering a man who had defeated his inner war. They were cheering someone who had learned how to sing over it. This is the part of the story people rarely linger on. They jump ahead to fame, to stages, to records and legends. But the foundation was already set long before that. A sensitive mind, an unstable sense of safety, and a belief, quietly reinforced over time, that sound was the only thing keeping the silence away. So when that sound eventually became his identity, what would happen if it ever failed him? And more importantly, what would happen when the world expected that voice to never stop? When he finally stepped back into the world, it wasn't because the darkness had lifted. It was because music gave him a reason to leave the room. Seattle in the 1980s wasn't glamorous. It was damp, isolated, heavy with unfinished dreams. A place where anger, frustration, and boredom mixed into something louder. This was where he found others like him. Not polished musicians, not stars in waiting, but people carrying the same restless weight. The early bands were rough, unstable lineups, cheap equipment, practice spaces that smelled like sweat and cigarettes. No promises, no safety net. But something happened when he sang. His voice didn't blend. It dominated. Not because it was trained, it wasn't. Not because it was controlled, it often wasn't. But because it carried urgency. People noticed, not fame-level attention, just enough to create expectation. And expectation changes everything. As Soundgarden began to form, the sound took shape quickly, heavy, unpolished, different from the clean rock dominating the radio. The band didn't aim for mass appeal. They aimed for honesty, even when it hurt. That honesty became their signature, and his voice became the weapon that delivered it. But with recognition came pressure. At first, it was subtle. Play better, sing louder, be more intense. Then it grew. Tour schedules tightened. Rehearsals stretched late into the night. Every performance demanded not just skill, but emotional exposure. Night after night, he was expected to bleed on command. For someone whose voice came from tension, not ease, this was dangerous. Intensity could not be turned on and off without cost. Yet stopping was an option. Momentum had started, and momentum doesn't ask how you're doing. As the Seattle scene gained national attention, everything accelerated. Journalists arrived, labels circled. Suddenly, a local sound was being framed as a movement, and he was placed at the center of it. From the outside, it looked like destiny. A shy kid finds his calling. A voice finds its audience. From the inside, it felt like losing control. Every song pulled something out of him. Every performance demanded access to emotions he didn't know how to protect. There was no separation yet between the man and the voice. No off switch. No saved version of himself away from the stage. The more successful the band became, the less space he had to be anything else. And still, the silence waited. Between shows, between rehearsals, in hotel rooms and quiet mornings. Music drowned out, but only temporarily. This is the part most origin stories skip. They show struggle and breakthrough, as if success solves the problem it grows from. But here, success amplified everything. The sensitivity that shaped his voice also made him vulnerable. The intensity that thrilled audiences also drained him. And no one around him had reason to question it, because it worked. The records sold. The crowds grew. The legend began forming. So the machine kept moving. But question lingered beneath all of it. Unspoken, unanswered. If his voice was built from tension and survival, how long could it keep carrying both the music and the man behind it? Fame did not arrive as an explosion. It crept in quietly, then refused to leave. As Soundgarden rose with the Seattle movement, the narrative formed quickly. A new sound, a new voice, a new symbol of something raw and real. On magazine covers and late-night stages, he was framed as powerful, fearless, almost indestructible. The voice reinforced the image. Wide range, unrelenting force, a sound that felt too big to come from a fragile place. Audiences believed strength was permanent because it sounded permanent. Behind the image, the pace accelerated. Tours stacked back to back. Interviews filled the days meant for rest. Performances demanded the same emotional intensity every night, without exception. There was no allowance for fatigue, no permission to be quiet. The voice had become a product. And products do not get tired. What the public saw was confidence. What they didn't see was depletion. The pressure wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Every show required him to access the same emotional depth, pain, rage, longing, and delivered on cue. For someone whose music came from unresolved places, that meant reopening wounds repeatedly. There was no space to heal between them. The more famous he became, The less room there was for privacy, the less privacy, the harder it was to stay grounded. Yet the machine kept rewarding him. Sold-out venues, critical praise, a growing reputation as one of the greatest voices of his generation. From the outside, everything looked like confirmation. Inside, it felt like pressure tightening, because the image left no room for weakness. Fans didn't come to see uncertainty. They came to hear power. So power became the expectation, even when it hurt. This is where the split began to widen. The public version grew larger, stronger, louder. The private version grew smaller, quieter, more isolated. And the gap between them became exhausting to maintain. There were moments when he tried to slow down, moments when the weight felt unsustainable. But stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. Momentum had replaced choice. Silence once again became the enemy. Between shows, the quiet returned, not restful, but heavy, filled with thoughts that had nowhere to go. Music could overpower for 2 hours on stage, but afterward, the noise faded, and silence always came back louder. This is a contradiction that fame never resolves. The more people rely on you to be strong, the less room you have to admit when you are not. And when strength becomes your identity, what happens the moment you feel it slipping? As the spotlight intensified and expectations hardened, the inner conflict deepened, quietly, invisibly. And somewhere along that path, the fight stopped being just about music. It became about survival. So when success reached its peak, and the image seemed complete to the world, one question remained unanswered. How long can someone live as a symbol before the human underneath starts to disappear? The darkness did not arrive suddenly. It had been waiting, long before the headlines, long before the final night. It lived in the spaces between tours, between albums, between the moments when the noise stopped working. Substances did not enter his life as rebellion. They arrived as tools, ways to slow the mind, ways to sleep, ways to quiet the pressure that never fully turned off. At first, they seemed functional. A drink to come down after a show. Something stronger to shut the door on thoughts that refuse to rest. The industry did not question it. Few ever do, in a world built on excess. Coping often looks like commitment. What mattered was that he showed up, that the voice still worked, that the performance delivered. So the warning signs stayed private. There were periods of collapse, followed by recovery, moments where he recognized the danger, moments where he stepped back, sought help, tried to regain control, and for a while it worked. Sobriety brought clarity. Routine returned. The voice remained intact. From the outside, this looked like victory. But recovery does not erase the original wound. It only teaches you how to live beside it. The pressure never disappeared. It simply changed shape. As years passed, the expectations didn't soften, they hardened. He was no longer just a successful musician. He was a legacy voice, a standard. Every performance was measured against his past. Every new project compared to a version of himself frozen in time. And time is unforgiving to voices built on intensity. The strain accumulated quietly. Physically, mentally, sleep became inconsistent. Thoughts looped. Silence regained its weight. At some point, medication entered the picture. Prescribed, controlled, meant to help. But chemicals don't understand context. They don't know history. They don't know the difference between survival and overload. They only amplify or suppress. In a system already stretched thin, even small changes mattered. This is where things became harder to read from the outside, because he still performed, still sang, still met expectations. The image held. What no one could see was the internal balancing act. Staying functional, staying present, staying alive one day at a time. There were warnings, but they were subtle, moments of disorientation, shifts in mood, the kind of signs that only make sense in hindsight. And hindsight is always cruel. The most dangerous phase was not the chaos. It was the appearance of stability, because stability convinces everyone, including the person living inside it, that the danger has passed. But unresolved pain does not disappear. It waits. It waits for exhaustion, for isolation, for a moment when the systems holding everything together weaken. And by the time anyone notices the weight shifting, it is often already too late. This is the part of the story where people want a clear cause, a single mistake, a single substance, a single bad decision. But reality is rarely that clean. This was not one choice. It was a pattern, a long negotiation between a sensitive mind and a world that demanded constant output. And every negotiation has a breaking point. The question is not whether that point existed. It's whether anyone, including him, recognized it in time. The final phase did not look dramatic. That is what made it lethal. From the outside, life appeared stable. Tours continued. Projects moved forward. Schedules were kept. He showed up. That was the proof everyone relied on. But stability can be deceptive when it is built on exhaustion. Sleep fractured into short stretches. Thoughts lost their edges, looping without resolution. Moments blurred together. Not enough to alarm anyone, but enough to erode balance. Medication was meant to help regulate the chaos, to slow the mind, to quiet the noise. Instead, it introduced new variables, subtle disorientation, changes in perception, a growing distance between intention and impulse. These were not red flags that stopped the machine. They were inconveniences that were worked around, because stopping still felt impossible. There's a dangerous belief in creative industries. As long as you perform, you are fine. And he performed. Night after night, the voice held, the body followed. The audience heard power, not warning. But the margin for error was shrinking. What few people understand is how thin that margin can become. When mental strain, physical fatigue, and chemical influence overlap, control doesn't vanish. It slips, not in a dramatic collapse. In a moment where judgment is delayed, where consequences feel distant, where the body moves before the mind fully understands why. That is what makes the final hours so difficult to explain. Not because they are mysterious, but because they are painfully ordinary. There was no grand farewell, no long goodbye, no clear signal that this was the end. Just a man who had spent his life outrunning silence, left alone with it. By the time anyone realized something had gone wrong, the balance had already tipped. And once it does, there is rarely time to correct it. This is a truth people struggle to accept. Not every tragedy announces itself. Some arrive quietly, disguised as another normal night. The final outcome wasn't the result of a single failure. It was a convergence of everything that came before it. Years of pressure, unresolved pain, a system that rewarded endurance over rest. So when we return to that night, the one after the show, the question changes. It is no longer what happened. It becomes something far harder. How many times had he come this close before without anyone noticing? From the outside, it looked like a return, a control life, a man who had been through the worst and survived. There were new projects, new collaborations, a sense, at least publicly, that the storm had passed. He spoke about recovery with clarity, about awareness, about the importance of staying present. People wanted to believe this chapter meant redemption, that the story had turned a corner, and for moments, it truly felt that way. He sounded grounded in interviews, focused, deliberate with his words. The voice was still there, older, weathered, but intact. To fans, this looked like proof that talent, discipline, and experience could outrun the past. But reinvention is not the same as repair. The structure of his life hadn't truly changed. It had only become quieter. The demands remained. Tours still required travel. Performances still demanded emotional excavation. Each show still asked him to access the same internal places. Only now he had less energy to recover afterward. There's a difference between standing again and standing on something stable. What he built in these later years looked solid from afar, but it rested on the same fragile foundation. Responsibility increased. Expectations sharpened. The margin for error narrowed even further. And there was something else. Age. The body doesn't recover the way it once did. The voice doesn't forgive strain as easily. Fatigue accumulates faster and lasts longer. The pressure became quieter, but heavier. Instead of chaos, there was vigilance. Instead of collapse, constant management. Living like that requires constant strength. And constant strength is not sustainable. This is where the idea of comeback becomes dangerous, because it suggests the battle is over. In reality, the battle had simply changed shape. He wasn't falling apart. He was holding together. And holding together can be just as exhausting. So when people looked at this period and saw stability, they missed the cost of maintaining it. They didn't see the effort it took to remain functional, to remain professional, to remain the voice. And that effort never showed on stage. Which brings us back to the question that haunts this story. If he had already survived collapse once, what made this time different? And more importantly, how do you recognize the difference between rebuilding a life and simply delaying the moment it finally runs out? After the silence, the world tried to make sense of what it had lost. Articles appeared, tributes poured in, clips of his voice circulated again, louder than ever. People replayed performances, searching for clues. A glance held too long, a note pushed too hard, a moment that might explain everything. None of it did, because legacies are built from what remains, not from what went wrong. What remained was a voice that changed the shape of modern rock, a sound that proved vulnerability could be powerful. That pain, when given form, could connect millions who never met. You can hear it in the artists who followed, in the way emotion is allowed to crack through control, in the permission to sound human, even when it hurts. But influence is not the same as understanding. For many, his story became a cautionary tale about mental health, about the cost of constant performance, about how easy it is to mistake functionality for safety. Yet even that framing feels incomplete, because he was not defined by the way his life ended. He was defined by how much of himself he gave away before it did. Every song carried a negotiation between strength and fragility. Every performance asked him to reopen something personal. And he did it anyway. That generosity is part of the legacy, too. The uncomfortable truth is this. The world benefits enormously from people like him, while rarely knowing how to protect them. We celebrate intensity. We reward endurance. And we often notice the cost only when the voice stops. So when his music plays now, it carries a different weight. Not just nostalgia, not just admiration, but awareness. Awareness that brilliance and suffering can coexist. That talent does not immunize anyone against silence. And that the loudest voices may be covering the quietest battles. This is not a story about failure. It is a story about limits. And about what happens when those limits are crossed slowly, invisibly, while the applause continues. So when you hear that voice again, strong, soaring, unmistakable, there's one question that lingers beneath the sound. How many people around us are still performing long after they've run out of strength to do it safely? When the voice stopped, the world filled the silence with noise. Headlines, opinions, explanations that try to turn something human into something simple. But silence does not ask to be solved. It asks to be understood. Chris Cornell was never just a voice. He was a place where pain and beauty met, and learned how to coexist. A man who turned inner pressure into sound so others wouldn't feel alone with theirs. What makes his story linger is not the way it ended. It's how long he carried the weight before it did. For decades, he gave people permission to feel deeply, to hurt, to question, to exist without pretending everything was fine. And yet, in the end, he was expected to do exactly that. Be fine, be strong, be the voice. There's a lesson here, but it isn't moral, it isn't clean, and it isn't comforting. It is simply this: survival is not a performance. Someone can sing perfectly and still be in danger. Someone can function, deliver, and smile while quietly slipping. The silence that followed his final note forces us to listen differently now, to hear what is beneath the sound, to notice the spaces between applause and exhaustion, because the most dangerous moments rarely announce themselves. They arrive after the lights go out, after everyone goes home, when there is no audience left to hold someone together. And maybe that is why his voice still hurts to hear. Not because it reminds us of what we lost, but because it asks us something we don't like answering. When the people around us are still standing, still working, still performing, how do we know they're truly safe? And if we don't know, are we really listening at all?